from Ken.
How's that? Can you hear me?
Sorry?
Poor.
But if you speak a bit loud, it just... I wonder if you try... Maybe...
Is the tie getting in the way? I can take it off.
If it does get in the way, we can put it on.
Right, okay. Good. Thanks very much. A request for air conditioning. I fear it's a case of we need to take back control. Okay. Now, I'm talking today on a subject which is highly topical but also highly confused. So I'm going to have to give you some sort of background before I get to what really interests me, which is questions of interpretation and understanding and analysis, and also in the long run some sort of prospectus for what can be done and what needs to be done. Of course, this will depend on one's own commitments and one's own values. I try and, as best I can, report on what the current state of the argument is, but of course occasionally you will see my own values are going to be sticking out. So I apologize in advance if there's a little bit too much subjectivity, but I think this is inevitable when one's talking about subjects as immediate and as contested as the subjects I'm going to be concerned with today. Here is the topic, populism and its enemies. The title has a vague allusion in it to a famous book by Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And Popper's book was wonderfully clear because he knew who the enemies were. One of the problems with today's topic is that since populism itself is a vague and ill-defined topic with several overlapping possible definitions, the enemies are a vague and undefined and not well-defined group of people. But I will be constantly coming back to a critical perspective as I go through, and I hope to, by the end of the week, have dissipated some of the ambiguities and made you aware of what I think are some of the really important issues at stake in this whole extraordinary wave of movements which have been revolutionizing the political world in the last few years. So there's my summary. I always put the summary up for people who are taking notes. Let's go into the start of the lecture. So, what's the kind of range of issues which we're looking at? For me, the most important thing is populism in the developed world. And this started some years ago. Revolts in southern Europe, in Greece and in Spain, the Syriza movement in Greece, Podemos in Spain, revolting against austerity imposed by Brussels and the European Central Bank. Those movements have not had the kind of success or the recognition which many people thought they would get. What has really shaken the bars has been the events in the United Kingdom, the vote to leave the EU, known as Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump in the United States. Contrary to all expectations and contrary to what a whole lot of people thought were kind of civilized standards of behavior and morality. So, big shock for people on both sides of the Atlantic among the English-speaking nations. And there are other populist movements which deserve attention in the developed world. I just mentioned Italy, one of my favorite countries, but I haven't been there for 4 years, I think, so I can't actually report firsthand on the progress of the Cinque Stelle, the five-star movement, which is the populist movement, which is now in coalition, ruling from Rome. And then, of course, we've had extraordinary events in France, Germany, and Sweden recently. In France, the populist challenge was beaten off by Emmanuel Macron from the centre, but to do so, he had to dismiss the existing centrist parties and amalgamate the fragments which were left. So it was a revolution from the centre, but in some sense the kind of populist furies have still been lingering around the edges. So in the last few months we've seen the Yellow Jackets movement, the Yellow Vests, which have been coming at Macron from both the right and the left, and are ready to take their insurgency into the streets. So populism is still kind of firing in France. In Germany, it's been the collapse of the Social Democratic Party and the rise of the Alternative for Germany. In Sweden, it's the new Sweden Democrats movement, which is still small. I think they got 18% of the vote in the last election, but very shocking to Swedes that these people could kind of come out of the closet at all. So we have had a populist wave throughout the developed world in the Northern Hemisphere, and there's also Eastern Europe. Hungary, Viktor Orban is a classic populist ruler, and perhaps not as well recognized in this part of the world as he is in Europe itself, but he has been an extraordinary example of a one-man band, a leader in the populist mold, full of a kind of a determination to reverse, as he sees it, the unhealthy tendencies of Europe, but himself, of course, rather like Macron, in the last few weeks and months, facing a further kind of populist revolt inside Hungary. Then Poland, the Law and Justice Party, and the last one I want to mention is Estonia, although I really know nothing about Estonia. Just chatting the other day to a friend who does know Eastern Europe said, you must remember Estonia. They've had a change of government recently, and it's been ascribed to populism. but I actually think he's exaggerating. It looks to me as if the people who come to power in Estonia are kind of centre-of-the-road social democrats. But no doubt somebody in the audience can set me straight about that. One of the great pleasures of lecturing at summer school is you invariably find there's somebody in the audience who can fill in the gaps in what the speaker knows. So that's the situation in Eastern Europe. Then in the third world, I want to mention Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro in Brazil. I was actually in Brazil for 2 weeks last year, in the period before the elections, and the whole country was in a state of vibrant expectation. And in fact, there was an attempt made on Bolsonaro's life, but paradoxically, it helped him in the polls. Everybody felt it was a low blow and that crime should be defeated. And so he got a sympathy vote, which he might not have done. In fact, my left-wing Brazilian friends were saying to me, being in hospital, that'll stop him tweeting. And the more he shuts up, the larger his vote is likely to be. So, a populist wave is sweeping the world, but the big question is it one thing? Do these movements have much in common? Are they, for example, all of them anti-establishment protest movements? That's one way of looking at things. That's quite a common way of looking at things. And of course, if the establishment is left-wing or right-wing in a particular country, the anti-establishment will have the opposite kind of orientation. So that helps to, if you have this view of things, it helps to explain the great varieties of populism. But there's a more sceptical kind of alternative explanation, and that's just to say that populism is a term of abuse. And the word populism, of course, goes back to the 19th century, where you had the great farmers' movement out on the prairie, which was known as American populism, and you had populism in Russia. And I will talk a bit about 19th century populism tomorrow. But it was, for many people already at the early part of the 20th century, a term of abuse. H.L. Mencken, the famous American wit, was always ready to kind of rub the populists' noses in it. They were the know-nothing party, the party of ignorance and prejudice. So the idea that populism is just a term of abuse is an old one. But the subject received serious academic attention already in the 1930s. And that was part, of course, of trying to understand the age of the dictators. And then in the 1950s, when a lot of American liberals believed that Senator McCarthy was a populist. But again, it was a term of abuse. A populist wasn't a true Democrat. It was somebody who was interested in a certain kind of fake democracy or demagoguery. So there's a long view that populism is just a term of abuse. It's something used by the enemies, by the elites, by the upper classes, by people who should know better, should be more respectful. But, of course, this is not really satisfactory. We do want to try and arrive at some usage which picks out something important and something factual. And of course, there are various ways of doing it. So there's been a huge outpouring of academic writing in the last 2 years. I've read a fair sample of it, but I don't think any single living person could claim to have read the lot. It's huge, and a lot of it's actually very repetitious or not very good. So I think anybody who tried to read what the academics have been writing about populism in the last 2 years would be engaged in a certain round of self-flagellation. But there are various sort of standard attempts to deal with this diversity. One is to distinguish left and right populism, and another is to talk about good and bad populism. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt, for example, who's somebody who in general I rather like and approve of, but he has his blind spots. He is a person who talks about good and bad populism, and for him the crucial thing is that good populism is a kind of trying to build coalitions, and bad populism is just about expressing hatred. So that's an example of people trying to draw a distinction, but the person I'm really wanting to talk about is Jan-Werner Mueller, the professor of politics at Princeton, and because I think his work is probably the best of the recent crop of writings on populism. It does have some interesting things to say, some not obvious things to say. Again, before I get there, I want to hone things down on certain kind of situations where we're all on the same page and we've got something common to talk about. So today I'm wanting to mainly talk about the Anglo-Saxon world. I want to talk about Brexit, and I want to talk about Trump. And again, I remind you that if this was a lecture or series of lectures by somebody who was a professional historian, somebody who's a how shall I say, a theorist, this would be full of detail, and I'd be telling you how various Tory politicians manoeuvred, and I'd be telling you about what the pollsters were analysing in the case of the American election. But I want to stand back from that and just give you a little bit of basics, as much as I need for purposes of exploring the theory a bit further. So I just want to remind you that the referendum on the British remaining in the EU was a result of a series of frustrations which were experienced by the governing Conservative Party after the year 2011. Some of the frustrations were with EU policy, because the Tories, like other people, were finding the dictates from Brussels onerous, but whereas people in other parts of Europe, I'm thinking here of Yanis Varoufakis, for example, the Greek finance minister in the Syriza government, were wanting to reform the EU. The British had a long tradition of Euroscepticism and hatred for Europe, which had been kept up by a number of tabloid newspapers over a long period. Part of the story, which populists like to tell, is about the corruption of the mainstream media. And sometimes they are not wrong, because here's a case in point. The British tabloids, for a long period, 40 years at least, were spreading lies about the EU. It was a kind of standard story which you could fill in the dots about the bureaucrats in Brussels having laid down rules about the size of the tomato, or the kind of regulations to be followed when fog set in, and all sorts of other kind of extraordinary things. So the standard story about the evil bureaucrats from Brussels was one which just kept rolling on, and an awful lot of it was invented in Britain and had very little basis in fact. And of course, you've got to remember that the EU, in some ways, is quite a weak sort of arrangement with all sorts of possibilities for opt-outs and kind of subsidiarity, as the technical term is, for constituent countries to go their own way. So the Conservatives had inherited a populace which was hostile to the EU in the first place, and were having genuine problems with the policies which were coming out of Brussels and especially out of Germany. So these were kind of issues, and David Cameron, the British Conservative leader, was trying to do his best, as he saw it, to kind of fight fire with fire, balance the Eurosceptics on the one hand, who were making his life miserable, against the bureaucrats from Brussels, who were also making his life miserable. But if he could somehow bring the two into conflict, he could put weight on the pan, having a referendum, and showing the bureaucrats in Brussels just how unpopular they were. But he didn't, I think, at all anticipate the result. In fact, nobody anticipated the result, even Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, on the night was kind of saying, we've only just been defeated, we've only just been defeated, and he was saying that until the Brexiteers actually won. So nobody anticipated the outcome, and it was brinkmanship. And I think the other point to make about it was, of course, it also related to internal politics, the leadership struggle in the Tory party, because a number of contending personalities, notably Boris Johnson, the colourful ex-mayor of London, were in the Brexit camp, or at any rate seemed to be pushing in that direction, and so there was a great deal of pressure inside the Tory party, and I think David Cameron just didn't really think through what the consequences would be of a referendum voting no. Let's leave. And of course, he was urging people to vote Remain, so when the vote went against him, he resigned. And as everybody will know, it's Theresa May, who had been a kind of moderate, not very enthusiastic Remainer before, who has taken over the premiership and is tasked with this unenviable task of trying to deliver the best Brexit which can be negotiated. Of course, that's where we are at the moment with Theresa May's deal, kind of very unattractive to the people who want Brexit, and very unattractive to the people who want to remain. It's one of those things with the people in the centre always in danger of being squeezed between the two sides. And here is a very good case in point. So we've got to see what happens in the next few days, what happens to the parliamentary situation, and whether the Theresa May's deal gets voted down, and if it does, what happens next, whether we go to a no-deal Brexit, or whether we do some sort of face-saving postponement, retracting Article 50 and trying again later, or whether we actually try to go for a further referendum in the hope of legitimating Remain. Now, I'm not really interested in the details of the parliamentary manoeuvring or the internal politics of the Conservative Party. What interests me is the mentality of the people who voted Leave. And this is a very controversial subject, because, of course, an awful lot of the Remainers are very passionate, are describing the Leavers in the most unflattering terms, as being a bunch of xenophobes and racists, or as being or there are various other ways to put it down. One of the more interesting comments of Konecki, who's a financial commentator, some of you may know his writing, he pointed out that in the opinion polls, the most important thing, apart from age, in predicting how voters would vote, and the age factor, of course, was that older people tended to vote Leave, younger people tended to vote Remain. Apart from the age factor, the most important thing was attitude towards capital punishment. The death there was a weird minority who believed that if we could only get back to having full British sovereignty, the first thing the Britons would do would be to restore capital punishment. I think that's extremely unlikely, and I think that Konecki is being a little bit unfair in trying to characterize the leaders with this kind of association with a kind of bloodthirsty and punitive attitude. I think it is the case that a lot of people in the Leave camp were feeling they had been betrayed, or that they'd been left behind, or that they'd lost control. That was probably the most powerful of the Brexit slogans, the slogan to take back control. And that was partly, of course, about borders. The nightly vision on TV of the refugees from Syria into the EU and generally managing to come over the peninsula to avoid the Italian Coast Guard and somehow make it into Europe. And that feeling of not being in control was a very important factor. And of course, that's just irrational. Of course, refugees and migrants don't make it, or easier to understand because a lot of Britons now have acquired. It's quite normal to go on summer holiday to Spain or Italy. They find it quite normal. Cheap flights across the channel to various destinations. The people in the university system sometimes will spend a semester abroad for young people. Populating reasons. And of course that was one of the troubles with the Remain campaign, always was stressing these kind of calculations and saying that every family in Britain would have to pay £4 or something like that this year and so much in the years afterwards. Well, of course, anybody who's been following economics at all well for a long time knows economists' predictions have got a huge uncertainty to them, almost as bad as meteorologists or climate scientists in this respect. So the Brexiteers kind of were ready to talk about this as Project Fear. The argument that Britain leading would fall off a cliff and there would be tragedies and disasters. Absolutely right. This is although it's also true that it's which a lot of costs which nobody imagined. So the question now, from our point of view, of course, is this. Do the people who advocated leave really describe as populist? They about the true Brexit and being ready to recognise the people's will. There is some populism in Britain, but again the question is this. It's all fair. Just and I think not. So that's the question I'm going to come back to. And of course I'm wanting to discuss the other case, which is the major consideration today, which is the US presidential elections. Now, you'll notice I have two slides here, one of Donald Trump and the other of his principal strategist, Steve Bannon. I didn't put up a slide of Hillary Clinton deliberately. And that's because I'm trying to focus on the populists. And it's quite clear that in the American case, the label populist is very suitable. It's, in the British case, it's difficult to think of anybody, not even Nigel Farage, perhaps, who should be counted as a simple populist, but Steve Bannon is a self-proclaimed populist. And has actually been, since he was ejected from the White House, involving himself in right-wing politics in Europe, trying to stir the populist pot internationally. And Donald Trump, I think, is a classic populist in various ways, constantly denouncing kind of East Coast elites, or sometimes just the coastal elites, because he dislikes the people in California as well, and just like the California liberals as well. So there's much justification in thinking of Trump as a populist. So whereas you couldn't say that about either Theresa May or Cameron, they are traditional conservatives who, for them, occasionally Theresa May has given some speeches with strange nationalist rhetoric in recently, but usually her main line, and the main line with which she's concerned, is the welfare of the United Kingdom and wanting to maintain the integrity of the country and trying to make Brexit as minimal damage as possible. Whereas Trump has a grand vision for changing the nature of American politics entirely, and Stephen Bannon even more so. Now, Steve Bannon is one of these extraordinary people. He is a kind of a self-taught, an autodidact intellectual, and some of the things he says are quite rational and impressive, and some of the things he says are crazy. So again, wants to look at that closely when you come to analyze the situation. But I wanted to go now to the main theory, which I'm concerned with today, which is in this book, What is Populism? I have my own copy here. Jan-Werner Mueller is a professor of political science at Princeton. He's of German origin. He's written 2 books in English, both of which are very good. There's also a book about democracy and its enemies, which I have and can strongly recommend. But this book, I think, is the one book which has come out in the last 2 years, which has really nailed something important. Because he reviews the literature, including that older literature which I'm going to dive into tomorrow, about American prairie populism and Russian revolutionary populism, and he looks at the literature from the 1950s, and he says this is all kind of interesting but not really relevant to what I'm interested in, which is trying to find a common framework where we can look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, we can look at Trump in America, we can look at Beppe Grillo in Italy, we can look at Marine Le Pen in France, and see commonalities. And the main thing he comes down with is a rhetorical trope. The populists are people who like to use the phrase, we the people. They identify themselves with the people in a country, whether they are in the majority or not. So that's the key test as far as Jan-Werner Mueller is concerned, but it goes with a set of attitudes. One is an anti-pluralist attitude, the attitude that other opinions don't count, other parties don't count, there should be a situation where all the good people are together and all think alike. So it's a rejection of intellectual pluralism, the diversity of views, and social pluralism, the diversity of groups. And it's a far-reaching attitude, and it shows up in various ways. It often goes with anti-elitism, because, of course, the populists are faced with this problem that the anti-Wall Street protesters in the United States used to say, we are the 99%, but the true populist says, we are the 100%. So you have to make the 1% really disappear or really hateful. So they become the elite who are being denounced with anti-elitist rhetoric. But it also goes with moralism. Why do you leave certain people out of the people or the true people? You leave them out if they're not good people. So this question of dividing the world in a Manichaean way into the good and the bad is a very important part of the populist attitude. And they're puristic. They want the good people to be purely good. They don't want them to be compromised in any kind of way. Compromise is bad. Compromise it puts you at risk of joining the bad people. Now, I've made two comments here on the right. On the left is a summary of Jan-Werner Mueller's first chapter, what populism is. His second chapter looks at what happens when populism enters into government. And when you've got somebody like Viktor Orban in power, he's got to have a series of excuses why things are not kind of going quite the way which he said they would go when he was out of power. So scapegoats have got to be found, and they can be the elite, they can be foreigners. There's this wonderful thing in Hungary where crime is divided into two kinds: politician crime and gypsy crime. These are the only two kinds of crime which are recognized in contemporary Hungarian political discourse of a populist kind. Now, although it purports to speak in the name of the people, populism may be highly undemocratic because it's refusing to recognize the legitimacy of other views and other voices who are excluded from the people as not being part of the true people. And here we have also some beautiful examples from America. A wonderful quote from Donald Trump. He says, the important thing is to achieve the unification of the people. All the rest don't matter. As a form of identity politics, populism is based on identity theft. It is taking the mantle of being the whole people when you are in fact just a part of the people. I'm going to come back to identity politics in the last lecture because it's also a major theme in the contemporary world which we have to come to terms with. But that's enough for now. Now, I wanted to make some kind of obvious, or perhaps in some cases not entirely obvious, points of critique of Mueller. The first one is that Trump and Bannon are evidently populists in terms of rhetoric and in terms of attitudes to opponents and critics. I'm thinking here of things like Donald Trump saying, lock her up, about Hillary Clinton. That is denying the legitimacy of the other party. And they always do assume that their own views are those of the American people. But the big question is the same true of all their followers? And here's my prime counterexample. What, for example, are working class Trump supporters who previously supported Bernie Sanders, the left-wing Democrat who was defeated or removed from contention in the democratic selection process? We know that there was some degree of rigging and fixing there, and of course a lot of Bernie supporters were feeling sore about that. But we also know that there were at least some 40,000, probably many more, Bernie Sanders supporters who refused to back Hillary and switched straight from Bernie to Trump. And those people, of course, are people who cannot be described as populists in the sense of having a kind of monopolistic sense of identity. They're people who are truly dissatisfied with the elite and with the policies of the American establishment and are ready to attack the establishment from either the right or the left in the hope, the desperate hope, they will get something better for it. And I want to say a little bit before going on to kind of cement this point about the enemies of populism. Because, of course, there have been a whole lot of kind of movements in the center denouncing Trump by the corporate Democrats or the Wall Street Democrats or whatever you want to call them. I was tempted originally to want to show you a chunk from Saturday Night Live, the very funny satire which managed to take down Steve Bannon, where Steve Bannon was portrayed as being the master in the White House and Trump merely his assistant. But I resisted that temptation. So instead I'm showing you a curious picture I found on the internet, making a comparison between Trump and Hitler. They've both got their mouths open in these shots. So you are supposed to get the impression from this shot that Trump and Hitler are the same sort of person. And since for most Americans Hitler is the most evil person imaginable, this is demonization. This is people demonizing Trump. Which I think is, of course, bad analysis, quite apart from bad morals. So let's go a little further with that. If critics of Trump are wrong to compare him with Hitler, there is an American leader with whom he can be compared. And this is Charles Lindbergh. The now largely forgotten American airline hero of the 1930s. He was a pioneer of aviation, and people have forgotten, most people I think nowadays, I've met very few people who are aware of this, that there was a close association between aviation and fascism in the 1930s. Mussolini's Minister of the Interior, Balbo in particular, was a great aviator, and famously on one occasion flew to America and landed on the lawn outside the White House. So there is this extraordinary romance with the pioneers of aviation, and Lindbergh was a major beneficiary of that. But and he also was convinced he could solve the problems of the Great Depression by imitating Mussolini. And so we have this extraordinary picture here on the right of a pro-Lindbergh rally where you can just see the slogan, America First, which is a slogan which Trump has revived. The other great slogan which Trump uses, Make America Great Again, is taken from Ronald Reagan. But America First comes from Lindbergh. Now, the real issue at stake, I think, is trying to understand the working class Trump supporters. Of course, Trump, as the candidate of the Republican Party, had a whole lot of knee-jerk Republicans voting for him because they always vote Republican. But the real interesting thing is the first-time voters who'd never voted before in their lives, who were working-class Trump supporters. And people who Hillary notably called out as a basket of deplorables. And that, to me, of course, just underlined, unfortunately, how out of touch she was, and also the extraordinary hold on the Democratic Party leadership of this conviction that they are the party of virtue. And anybody who disagrees with them must be racists and bigots, if not worse. So the only reason she could think of why people might vote for Trump was if they were racists. Now, if you want to understand the Trump voters, there's no better place to look than a book written by the American historian and journalist Thomas Frank, long time ago. I think it came out in 2004. Unfortunately, I haven't got my copy here with me today. It's a wonderful book. It's called What's the Matter with Kansas? Now, Thomas Frank grew up in Kansas and grew up there in the 70s. And in those days, Kansas was a strongly democratic state. And that was applicable both to the towns and the rural areas. But something happened. And when Thomas Frank went back at the end of the 90s, he found that Kansas had changed over to being pretty thoroughly Republican. The Republicans who previously had been the party of the golf circuits and the country clubs and generally the affluent were now getting voting support from the workers and the farm population. So he asked, why was this? It's a fascinating book. It has a large number of ways of trying to get at the answer. He goes and interviews people. He goes and traces down what's happening economically. And what's happening economically is not good because industry is in a state of collapse and is being exported to Japan and Korea. The family farms are struggling, and many family farmers are giving up because the land is being bought by agribusiness. So the little people of Kansas are really suffering at the hands of the Republicans. So it's especially paradoxical that the people of Kansas are voting solidly Republican whenever given the opportunity. And it's a fascinating book showing how the situation was such that the Republicans were able to mobilize these people. And it all starts at the time of the Reagan Revolution, or perhaps a little earlier even in some cases, with cultural issues. It's the situation where the Democratic Party is being accused of being the party of gun control and the party of abortion. So many Kansas voters who are socially conservative feel that their values are being threatened or betrayed by the Democrats. And it's really a quite extraordinary sort of mobilization because it runs completely contrary to the economic interests of these people. It would make sense for them to vote for the Democratic Party, but two things have happened. The Republicans are playing the cultural card and appealing to working class culture. And the Democrats have lost contact with the union movement The McGovern Democrats removed trade unions from representation on the Democratic National Committee because they were worried that trade unions were unsound on foreign policy. So the Democratic Party has turned its back on the people, and the Republican Party is welcoming the people